Two major policy impacting events have come to the forefront in less than a decade. First, policy development on climate change has accelerated since the EPA's Clean Energy Plan and the Paris 15 Accord. Second, the shale gas and oil revolution has reduced concerns about energy security. These two developments have caused a rethinking of energy-related issues among the policy elite. During this forum, we will discuss whether or not technology and innovation help us simultaneously address climate change mitigation and energy dependence, methods to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, commercialization of renewable energy resources, and how to prioritize national energy policy issues. These topics will be discussed from the point of view of authors of several books that cover these subjects. Mike Adams and Karl Vornsand will be addressing these topics on behalf of Jeffrey Sachs, the author of The Age of Sustainable Development. In this book, Sachs presents a practical framework for how global citizens can address the worldwide problems of persistent extreme poverty, environmental degradation, and political economic injustice. Sachs outlines the holistic way forward of sustainable development and the practical pathways to achieve sustainable development goals. Marc Faulkner will be addressing these topics on behalf of Karsten Neuhoff, the author of Climate Policy After Copenhagen. In this book, Neuhoff discusses the UN climate negotiations in Copenhagen, where 117 heads of state concluded that low-carbon development is necessary in order to combat climate change, and that the transition to a low-carbon economy requires the implementation of a portfolio of policies and programs. This book also addresses problems surrounding the implementation of the European Emission Trading Scheme, including the role of vested interests, the impact of design details, and opportunities to attract long-term investments. It also shows how international climate cooperation can be designed to support the domestic implementation of low-carbon policies. Finally, Adam Peterson and myself, Dan Grubba, will address topics of discussion on behalf of Richard Tol, the author of Climate Economics. In his book, Richard Tol presents a comprehensive treatment of neoclassical environmental economics with reference to the problem of climate change and climate change mitigation. To begin our discussion, we will first talk about technology and innovation. Marc, with Neuhoff in mind, is it possible for technology and innovation to help us simultaneously address both climate change mitigation and energy independence goals?
Yes, it can, Dan. Energy independence will result from our efforts to mitigate climate change. So the objective is not only to reduce carbon emissions from existing energy sources, but also to increase zero carbon development in our society, such as wind and solar, among many others. Investment in technology in the renewable sector will develop results that both mitigates climate change and increases our energy independence by allowing our energy production to increasingly develop from renewable energy rather than imported hydrocarbon sources. This requires a long-term energy policy, initiating carbon pricing, which can create confidence within investors that the renewable industry is supported and here to stay. This will drive investment in the renewable sector. Investors must see carbon pricing as long-term in order to motivate their decision process. If investors don't see the long-term commitment in the policy, they will likely not account for carbon pricing in their decision-making process. The key is to steer investors towards investing in technology that enhances a zero-carbon society. Unfortunately, this process has taken a step backwards this week with the Supreme Court putting a hold on President Obama's clean energy plan. Although I found it initially lacking in sufficient breadth to stimulate the investment they claim will occur, as they focused on power plants rather than all emitters.
Karl, does Jeffrey Sachs have a different opinion on whether or not technology and innovation can help address climate change and energy independence?
No, Dan. There's a consensus that technology and innovation can simultaneously help us address both goals of climate change mitigation and energy independence. We're already seeing sharply declining prices for renewable energy sources, and with innovative energy policy such as a carbon tax or cap and trade, this will further level the playing field for non-carbon emitting energy sources. Additionally, R&D into renewables will only further decrease cost and increase efficiency. Holistically, there should be a three-pronged approach to addressing climate change. Number 1, energy efficiency. Number 2, low-carbon electricity such as wind, solar, nuclear, and carbon capture and sequestration. And number 3, fuel switching for transportation such as electric-powered vehicles. As far as timing, technology that I already mentioned in conjunction with the sensible energy policy promoting low or ideally zero carbon emission energy sources can immediately begin the deep decarbonization process. Future technological advances into battery technology will give renewables even greater legitimacy as energy storage issues for intermittent energy are no longer a roadblock. With respect to energy independence, expanding solar and wind energy, of which the U.S. has ample resources, will further limit dependence on foreign oil. Also, carbon capture and sequestration is a technology that should allow for domestic coal and natural gas to help fill out the U.S. energy portfolio for the foreseeable future, even though carbon capture and sequestration needs further research as far as safety and efficiency.
Thank you, Karl. Adam, does Richard Toll express the same opinions as Carsten Nieuwhof and Jeffrey Sachs?
Yes, Dan. Technology innovation help us simultaneously address both goals. However, the current efforts would need to be increased to stabilize emissions. Adaptation reduces the need to mitigate climate change, and mitigation reduces the need to adapt. Whereas effective mitigation depends on the actions of other countries, effective adaptation really does. As the difficulties with reaching an international agreement on emission targets become increasingly apparent, attention has shifted to adaptation. Technology changes is why emission reduction is expensive in the short term, but cheaper in the medium to long term. Although there has been rapid progress in oil and gas exploration, this has been about unlocking relatively expensive reserves. In contrast, we can still expect major technology breakthroughs in solar power and bioenergy. Furthermore, the easily accessible sources of fossil fuel are getting exhausted. So over time, we can expect the cost of fossil fuel to rise and the cost of renewables to fall, as the cost of emission reductions are driven by the difference in cost between fossil and renewable energy. Abatement costs will fall over time.
Thank you, Adam. Now that we've discussed whether or not technology and innovation can help us address climate change mitigation and energy independence goals, what do we think are the most effective measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Mike Adams, will you go first and tell us a little bit about what Mr. Sachs has to say on this subject?
Well, Dan, Jeffrey Sachs takes a more holistic approach to addressing sustainability and subsequently reducing greenhouse gas emissions by supporting 10 Sustainable Development Goals created by the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. These 10 Sustainable Development Goals include ending extreme poverty and hunger on a global scale, achieving economic development within planetary boundaries, ensuring effective learning for all children and for youth for their lives and livelihood, achieving gender equality, social inclusion, and human rights for all, achieving health and well-being at all ages, improving agricultural systems and raising rural productivity, empowering inclusive, productive, and resilient cities, curbing human-induced climate change and ensuring sustainable energy, securing ecosystem services and biodiversity, and ensuring good management of water and natural resources, and number 10, transforming governance for sustainable development. It's important to point out that climate change and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is a global problem in size and scale. The reduction of greenhouse gas emissions requires measurable progress be made with each of these sustainable development goals in order to adequately affect climate change on such a large scale.
Thank you, Mike. Marc, does Carsten Nieuwhof tend to agree or disagree with Jeffrey Sachs' suggestions?
The ideas Mike just mentioned certainly wouldn't hurt the effort to reduce greenhouse gases, but accomplishing these ideas requires financial support. There must be an incentive for investors, and a combination of carbon pricing and effective policy would fulfill that need. This illustration from the World Bank shows higher prices for energy does lead to reduced energy usage. Energy is not so elastic as it was once thought. For example, Finland and Sweden have had the largest environmental tax increase and show the highest emissions response. Now, carbon taxes have a greater result on small emitters in production and consumption environments. They are short-term changes and can be revisited annually. So, for example, architects and engineers, they can make design choices to use less carbon-intensive products if the price is cost beneficial to the project they are working on. This is an effect where a tax can create a change in behavior. On a large scale, cap and trade is more beneficial in infrastructure and manufacturing, which are widely considered as the large emitters. Cap and trade allows decision makers the time to make the long-term investment choice that best suits their needs. However, the cap and trade allowances must be able to adjust over time as technology advancement will benefit the carbon reduction. Bringing both carbon taxes and a cap and trade system together requires a government policy. A long-term credible policy reduces the risk associated with investing in low-carbon technology. So, for example, research-led attempts in the U.S. in the 1980s focused on building multi-megawatt wind turbines and failed both on engineering and cost. While in Denmark, they adopted a government-led policy in 1981 outlining a target of 10% wind contribution by the year 2000, which created investor confidence in the future of the industry. Denmark has so much investor confidence in the renewable sector, they now aim to produce 50% of their electricity from wind energy by the year 2020, and they are well on their way, as the Huffington Post just recently on January 18th published a story citing Denmark had already produced 42% of their electricity by wind power last year in 2015. Their long-term government policy gave the confidence required for significant investment.
According to Richard Toll, emission reduction costs money, and without climate policy, emissions are free. Without climate policy, emissions are not. Although it is not explicitly stated, if I had to rank the author's opinion of the most effective vehicles to slow or ultimately stop climate change in descending order, starting with the most effective, these would be cap and trade, a carbon tax, and regulatory restrictions. My justification for this order is based on the author's level of detail and opinion of the effectiveness of each strategy. Cap and trade is covered mainly by discussing tradable permits. Richard Toll goes on to say that with tradable permits, the regulator sets an overall cap on consumption, production, or emissions. This overall emissions cap is then split into units, and each emitter receives a certain amount of permits to emit. If a company finds that it has too few permits, it may buy additional permits from a company that has too many. The author touches on this strategy in several chapters. Implementing a carbon tax seems to be Richard Toll's second most favorable option. He mentions that a successful carbon tax would have to increase over time and would naturally find a Pareto optimum. The Pareto optimum is found because the carbon tax would change the choices that people make, which would lead the market to equilibrium. This tax revenue could be used to reduce other distortionary taxes for increased welfare. Regulatory restrictions are also covered, and the author refers to them as a command and control technique. Toll is not fond of this method because he realizes that a one-size-fits-all solution is difficult in the energy arena. Now that we've discussed several authors' opinions on which methods would be best suited to reduce greenhouse gases, it's time to talk about a call to action to achieve this. Karl, is it time for an all-out push to commercialize renewable energy resources, or should the government focus primarily on research and development?
Thanks, Dan. Yes, it is time to make an all-out push to commercialize renewable energy sources. Climate change has already caused massive damage, and waiting any longer will assuredly cause further damage. Current global temperature has risen by 0.9 degrees Celsius over average since before the pre-industrial era, and is expected to rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, excluding any further CO2 emissions. Ocean heating lags behind land heating, so this increase of 0.6 degrees Celsius is already expected to occur just with a delay from the current time. Rising global temperature can and will continue to adversely affect food and water supplies, ecosystems, and extreme weather events. As previously mentioned, renewable energy has already come down significantly in cost. Wind is already competitive with fossil fuels in areas with sufficient wind resources. With proper energy policies such as a carbon tax or cap and trade, the externality of CO2 emissions can be properly accounted for, and renewable energy sources will have greater price parity with fossil fuels. The primary issues with utilizing renewable resources is that many times renewable energy resources are located far from population centers, which will require vast distribution systems for transportation. Additionally, storage technology is not currently advanced enough to store intermittent energy sources and supply energy on demand. However, some renewable energy resources, such as off the eastern coast, are directly adjacent to major population centers, and storage technology has recently begun making great strides. A continuation of current R&D should more than cover current shortfalls, helping to further the advancement of renewable energy sources.
Thank you, Karl. Adam, what does Richard Toll think about commercialization versus government-focused research and development?
The commercialization of renewable energy resources are expensive, volatile, and unpredictable, and bring their own environmental problems. And the governmental focuses on R&D would mean fewer people working on R&D in other areas such as medicine. We need to start by boosting the number of smart and creative people by improving nutrition, healthcare, and education. Currently, diverting from R&D towards energy and agriculture would be expensive since these are small sectors in the economy. The way that the R&D is made is through patents, and patents are generic instruments that serve for all innovations. So another one of the instruments is the R&D subsidies and tax breaks. There are a couple of problems with this approach. First, they reward efforts rather than success. Second, R&D subsidies are often very specific, and usually politicians and civil servants decide on what particular technology is worthy of support. It may be the politicians and civil servants that have the excellent foresight in these products are likely to succeed in the marketplace. But more often than our government backs the wrong horse.
Thank you, Adam. Mike, what does Jeffrey Sachs think about these options?
Well, Dan, it's likely time for both an all-out push to commercialize renewable energy resources and a focus on government-led research and development. Jeffrey Sachs notes that several large renewable energy projects are being considered right now. For example, an offshore wind power generation farm off the coast of the United States and a hydropower unit on the Inga Falls in the Congo River in Africa. These massive commercial renewable energy projects will require serious global commitment to low carbon energy in order for them to be successful and financially viable. In addition to and in conjunction with these projects, governments must continue to support research and development that fosters the discovery of technological breakthroughs that enhance the viability of both large mega projects and smaller individual systems that can be utilized by both the individual consumer and larger populations in a manner that will reduce impacts to climate change.
Thank you, Mike. After reading our respective books and getting a feel for our author's point of view on national energy policy issues, how would we think that they prioritize them? Marc, how do you think Carsten Nieuwhof would rank national security, competitive markets, the environment, climate change, and consumer equity in regards to these issues?
Well, Dan, given the nation's participation at Kyoto, Copenhagen, and most recently this past year at Paris, I think climate change will be a major priority in energy policy, as a world leader should lead by example. Competitive markets will also play a vital role in energy policy as competition in a carbon pricing environment will protect consumer equity. Competition will prevent the excess pass-through of cap-and-trade pricing on large emitters, while carbon taxes will help incentivize behavior change of small emitters. National security will continue to be a priority in energy policy, as hydrocarbons will play a vital role in the future of the United States, especially considering the U.S. infrastructure is almost entirely built around the use of hydrocarbons. However, it is of less concern considering the advancement of our domestic oil and gas production. National security will increasingly take a backseat to other priorities as we shift our culture to a low-carbon society where dependence on foreign energy sources will dwindle.
Thank you, Mark. Mike, how would Jeffrey Sachs rank these issues?
I believe that Jeffrey Sachs would rank national energy policy issues in the following way. The highest priority would be on climate change, a global crisis that affects every part of the planet today. Potential solutions to climate change are very complex and will impact the global economy and the lives of the entire population. Energy policy that sets strict limits on the emissions of greenhouse gases and other harmful activities that contribute to climate change should be immediately enacted to foster a steady transition to alternative and green sources of energy. The next priority would be on the environment. Environmental changes are occurring around the globe as we speak, and as a result of human activity and climate change. Human activity is interrupting planetary biodiversity, causing land degradation and deforestation, and air and water pollution. As a result, we are effectively exceeding planetary boundaries as a global population. Third priority would be on consumer equity. The United Nations developed 8 Millennium Development Goals in September of 2000 in their unprecedented Millennium Declaration. These goals include the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger, to achieve universal primary education, and to develop a global partnership for sustainable development, to name 3. Constructive energy policy should provide a means for citizens in the United Nations define poverty situations, the means to have access to and utilize energy in a manner that is conducive to consumer equity, a reasonable standard of living, and social inclusion. I'll defer to Karl to address the remaining 2 energy policy issues that I didn't prioritize here in just a few moments.
Thank you, Mike. Adam, what do you think Richard Toll has to say about this subject?
Thanks, Dan. Toll would prioritize the national energy policy issues into climate change, the environment, consumer equity, competitive markets, and national security. Climate change is the highest priority among the other energy policy issues. Climate policy would serve as a domestic constituent. Climate change has a positive and negative impact and effects negative or small compared to national growth. 7 things stand in the way of a simple solution. First, there would need to be for an explanation for the world in terms of the sin or final reckoning. Climate change is often viewed as a religious exercise. A mission being the sin leads to a climate change which is eternal doom. Second, climate change is perfect for politicians. And thirdly, climate policy allows bureaucrats to create new bureaucracies. Fourthly, climate policy can be used to create rents in the form of subsidies, grandparented emission permits, mandate markets, and tax breaks. Fifthly, climate policy requires government intervention at a global level. Sixthly, greenhouse gases emissions reduction is a global public good. And lastly, global climate policy has been used as a tactical argument for those who desire a world government for other reasons. The second priority would be the environment. We are currently changing the temperature in the environment, and by 2100, the author estimates that the global mean temperature is probably 1 to 4 degrees Celsius higher than now. Water expands as it warms and the level rises. Land ice melts. By 2100, the sea will probably rise by 0.2 to 0.6 meters. As more CO2 dissolves in water, oceans will become more acidic. The third priority would be consumer equity. Consumer equity in climate change varies greatly between countries. Particularly, poor countries tend to be most vulnerable. As the willingness to pay to reduce the health risk is bound by the ability to pay, health risk in poor countries are deemed to be less severe than healthy risks in rich countries. Competitive markets and national security. The author didn't explicitly address these items, but he implicitly expressed the importance of both. The government should take the lead in adaptation. The government clearly has a role to play as a facilitator or a private adaptation, as a regulator and as a service provider. An example is the government may run awareness campaigns to help unsuspecting populations during a heating or cooling event, but there is no need for a complete government intervention.
Thank you, Adam. Karl, what stance does your author take?
The two lower-ranked energy policy issues that Mike didn't already touch on would be national security and competitive energy markets. The author didn't specifically address these as high importance on the energy policy issues scale, but one can extrapolate what the author has to think on the subject. Competitive energy markets would need to include alternative energy to reduce carbon emissions. Currently, there are limited geographical regions and alternative energy sources that are competitive with conventional fossil fuels. Therefore, proper energy policy would need to be implemented to include the externality cost of greenhouse gas emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. This would increase the cost of carbon-emitting energy sources and help bring price parity with alternative energy sources. Next, national security would be further assured by increasing alternative carbon-free energy sources, thereby reducing dependence on foreign oil. As the U.S. develops wind and solar resources, less energy will need to be supplied from conventional carbon-emitting sources. The author doesn't necessarily stress that national security would be further ensured by switching to carbon-free energy, but it's a natural conclusion considering the U.S. has vast wind and solar resources.
Thank you, Karl. If it's okay, I would like to make a few comments about Richard Toll's stance in an effort to supplement what Adam said before you. First, I would tend to agree with the rest of the group that climate change is the highest priority in the list. This is not only my opinion, but what I've gleaned is the opinion of Richard Toll as well. The environment also ranks very high, coming in second. The underlying purpose of climate economics is, after all, about preserving the environment. I would like to take a different stance on consumer equity and competitive markets than those stated before. If by competitive markets we mean a competitive landscape to reduce emissions and further participate in permit trading, then Richard Toll more than adequately discusses this, specifically in Chapter 4 of Climate Economics. The consumers in this scenario would be the emission producers, and their equity would be preserved by regulation and international buy-in of a permit trading system. In closing, there are three overarching principles that each author seems to cover in a different and unique way. The first principle is that climate change is an issue and something must be done about it. Mike Adams and Karl Vornsand, on behalf of Jeffrey Sachs, agree that there has already been substantial climate damage and there must be immediate and drastic action taken to help mitigate further damage. There must be an immediate worldwide decarbonization utilizing proper energy policy promoting low or zero carbon energy sources. Marc Faulkner, on behalf of Karsten Neuhoff, maintains that the price of energy is more elastic than once thought, and carbon pricing can motivate behavior towards climate change. Finally, Adam Peterson and myself, Dan Grubba, agree that Richard Toll believes that climate change is a high priority and can be mitigated using policy instruments like regulation, taxes, subsidies, and permits. The second principle is that technology will play a key part in helping to reduce climate change by reducing carbon emissions. After reading The Age of Sustainable Development, Mike Adams and Karl Vornsand agree that low carbon emission energy technology currently exists and can be competitive with current energy sources within a proper energy policy environment. Further R&D into alternative energy will only further reduce costs and level the competitive playing field. Taking the point of view of Karsten Neuhoff, Marc Faulkner maintains that technology requires investment that can be accomplished by creating investor confidence using carbon pricing and long-term policy. To offer another point of view, climate economics, as interpreted by Adam Peterson and myself, states that technology does indeed play a critical role in reducing climate change and carbon emissions. Current efforts would need to be increased, which may add short-term costs to emission reduction. Short-term aside, this boost in efforts may make future emission reduction cheaper in the long run. The third and final overarching principle is that the use of energy policy instruments such as carbon taxes or cap and trade will help reduce carbon emissions. Mike Adams and Karl Vornsand uncovered these topics in The Age of Sustainable Development, wherein Jeffrey Sachs says that it would be easiest to legislate and oversee a carbon tax to help reduce carbon emissions. As externality costs of carbon emissions rise, carbon taxes should increase to equally account for these costs. Cap and trade can work too, but it's more difficult to properly implement. Marc Faulkner found examples of these energy policy instruments in Climate Policy After Copenhagen. In this book, Karsten Neuhoff says it should be a combination of carbon pricing and policy in order to motivate the investment needed to shift to a low-carbon society. Finally, Adam Peterson and myself found examples of these energy policy instruments throughout climate economics. Richard Toll tends to prioritize cap and trade. However, he places value on a carbon tax and discusses the economic effects of implementing such a tax. Overall, each book offers a unique perspective of climate policy and emission reduction techniques. Combined, these books create a powerful tool that can be used to combat climate change and preserve our planet's future. Thank you for listening.